Hey everybody, we're going to get started here today with a conditional statement. And a conditional statement, you may recall, is an if-then statement. And a great example of one is, if I get off work at 5 p.m., I will meet you for dinner. There's no word then in there, but this is an if-then type scenario. So there's one statement, if I get off work at 5, then there's a second statement, I meet you for dinner. And so we write that as P, and then an arrow, and then Q. And so if both of those things are true, if I get off work at 5 and I meet you for dinner, then the whole statement is true because I will have done what I said I was going to do. Now let's play around with this statement a little bit and negate P and then negate Q and then negate both of them and see if it makes sense and see if you can say that this thing is false. So if P is true and Q is false, that says if I get off work at 5 p.m., I don't meet you for dinner. And that's false, right? You lied in that case. This is the case where you could call someone a liar. They got off work at 5, but they still didn't meet you for dinner. All right. Now, if P is false, that says if I don't get off work at 5, and then Q is true, I meet you for dinner. So you might imagine there's a scenario where I could still meet you for dinner even if I don't get off at 5. Maybe I get off a little bit later, and we can still meet for dinner. But you wouldn't call me a liar in that case. We're going to learn about biconditionals later, and that's a place where you can call someone a liar in this situation. All right, and then if P is false and Q is false, it reads, if I don't get off work at 5, I don't meet you for dinner. And again, we would assume that's true because I can't make any guarantees about meeting for dinner if I don't get off at 5. So what we say about this for a conditional statement is there is no guarantee about what happens if the first statement, which we call the antecedent, is false. So we assume the whole conditional statement is true in that case. All right, the only time that I will have lied is if I get off work at 5, that I'll leave you hanging for dinner, right? So that leads to this truth table where we have if true, then you get true. And if true, then false, that's where you get false. And otherwise, we assume it's true. So when we start to look at conditionals, what we start to look for is where the if, then, the first part of the statement is true and the second part of the statement is false. So let's look at this little example here. We've got not, and then if Q, then P. Notice how they switched up the P and Q here. So they've got Q on the left and P on the right. So the first thing, remember, we're looking for the case. The only time this is anything other than true is when the first thing is true and the second thing is false. All right, so again, we're looking in reverse order because this is Q, then P. So right here you see Q is true and P is false. That's the only time this thing is false. All right, and so we write false there. And so all the rest of these are going to be true. Because if the first thing is true and the second thing is true, then it's true. And here, the Q is the first statement. If they're false, it's always true. And finally, we're going to negate this. If Q, then P, we're going to say not that. So we reverse all these truth values. Instead of true, true, false, true, it's false, false, true, false. And that would be the answer to this truth table. And as we're going to learn a little later, there are various ways to state conditionals. There's the if you live in Houston, then you live in Texas. But you can also say living in Texas is necessary for living in Houston. In other words, if you want to live in Houston, you're going to have to live in Texas too, right? Or living in Houston is sufficient for living in Texas. So in other words, if you want to live in Texas, then living in Houston will take care of that for you. All residents of Houston are residents of Texas, or being a resident of Houston implies being a resident of Texas. These are all different ways that you may see stated later on in word problems, how a conditional statement may be stated. It's not always an if-then. You may have these necessary, sufficient, and other terms.